kind of want to take some time and transition over to talking about conversations, talking about how we talk to each other, how we talk to people that either have a different worldview or maybe even have the same, but maybe we're just questioning and learning together. And I want to start with the cross and the resurrection, and even just talking about language that maybe you have used, or when you're talking about, I don't know, something that connects to people that maybe they've never heard that before. And like I say the cross, and you want to, someone says it here and it has instant meaning for me, but for someone who doesn't, what's some language of things that you would maybe suggest or try?
Yeah, so I usually start with the words. This is going to sound like a smart aleck response, but I promise it's not. I usually start with the words that the Bible uses in reference to the cross. So 3 that immediately jump to mind are forgiveness, love, and humility. When we talk about Jesus on the cross, these are the 3 words that constantly come up: sacrifice, forgiveness, love, and humility. Like, these words are descriptors of what happened on the cross and what. So a big fancy theological word, imputed. It just means that Jesus is, when we believe in what Christ did on the cross, what Jesus the Christ did on the cross, then his actions are imputed to us. It's a little bit deeper meaning than just given or received to us. Like, it becomes us. It's our identity. It's who we are. So it's imputed to us. And so all of those 4 things, I said 3, but there's actually 4. We've experienced them. We've experienced them in tangible ways throughout our lives. Either other people have bestowed them on us, or we have bestowed them on others. And so we've experienced, at least in part, what Christ did on the cross. And so I think starting with these kind of common denominators that have been experienced by people: forgiveness, love, sacrifice, humility, and what's beautiful is these are the things that we're naturally attracted to. We're drawn to them. So in a way, we are drawn to the cross naturally without even using the word cross. Mm-hmm. Like, when we talk about things that we see in other people that attract us to them, those are 4 of the top ones that I would list. People that have shown me love, people that I know are genuinely humble, people that have sacrificed pieces of their lives for me. Like, I think about my mom. When I think about when she had me at 18 years old, and all the sacrifices that she made for me, like, those are cross moments throughout her life that she laid down for me. And so I know what Jesus did on the cross. I experienced it. I saw it, and I got to experience it through that. So I think having conversation jump off points with those kind of common denominators is an easy kind of starting point.
Finding references of things that would connect with someone that they'd understand. So exactly. Like, talking about your mom is something that other people would connect to, and it leads into another conversation.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd add, Zach?
I mean, if I was getting into a conversation about it, I wish it presented itself more to have the conversation, but it rarely does. But if I was getting into the conversation more about the resurrection or something like that, the things I'd like to there's just one line of reasoning that I really like, and it's the minimal facts argument is what it's called, and it's just basically facts about Jesus' life, death, and the aftermath that you have to do something with. Like, they can't be ignored. So whether you are a Christian or an atheist or something, you have to respond to them. The facts that, how do you explain, the fact that Jesus really died, because that's a proven fact, that the tomb was empty. There's like 12. There's a bunch of them, but that the resurrection appearances, that the disciples at least think they saw something. I mean, they responded in a way that suggests that they, in their minds, saw, or they saw something. That another fact is that the fact that the women are the first included in the account, because back in Bible times that was written, the woman's word, her testimony wasn't really taken in account. So if you're making up the story, you wouldn't include them. And then the explosion of the church, and the disciples' complete change from fearful, scared people to these people that were willing to die for their beliefs. Just I just personally like that, because it's letting them try to decide how to deal with that, instead of me giving them a bunch of reasons.
It's still presenting information in a relational way and not so much of a like, hey, here's all the information. You got to change your mind right now. Like there's every conversation we've had on the podcast during the series, relationship is always sprung to the top. Like that has to be part of the factor to even probably even have the conversation, unless someone, it comes up in a very unique opportunity. But as we transition, you were talking about the resurrection. The last week of the series, we talked about the resurrection and really asking the question, is there hope? And I think that's a question that society and just kind of culture is asking a lot, whether we see that in the next generation, especially when they're asking that question, seems more and more. And even as we grow older and asking, people are asking for purpose and hope. And the resurrection, we would say, is that hope? If you're having a conversation even about that, similar things, maybe you would say having reference points of things that connect to people. But I don't know, even just talking about that, anything that just kind of spurs in your mind when you're talking about hope and the resurrection.
Yeah, let me back up,
Yes.
back to the cross. And then, so I think I want to be very careful what I say here, because this could get me in some hot water. Be very, very clear to all the listeners out there. I am in no way taking away from the cross, okay? But the gospel is more than the cross. The gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news of the kingdom that come. And the cross is one piece of Jesus's life, of what he came to accomplish as his mission, and the resurrection would be another one. Thankfully, we've recaptured some of that here in the last, I feel like 20, 30 years. We've recaptured the importance of the resurrection and the good news that the reality of the resurrection ushers in, hope being the number one. I think about N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. He was doing his research on his 600-page book on the historical reliability of the resurrection. And what he was surprised by through that studies is the kind of more existential thing that happened to him as hope filled him through the reality of Jesus' resurrection. And so then he goes through and looks at all the ramifications of the resurrection and how that informs the good news. But that's also, the resurrection is also, so you could maybe boil it down to a simplistic presentation of Jesus's life as the incarnation, or his life, the crucifixion, the cross, the resurrection, empty tomb, and then the ascension, the heaven. And those are kind of the four pieces, if you will, that kind of give up the holistic part of the good news of Jesus. And each one brings new realities, just like hope and the resurrection did, to the good news of the Christian life and impacts our everyday life. Like the fact that we do have a way of life, that there is, Jesus went about living a way of life, and so we do have a moral reference. That's really, really, really important, right?
Especially considering it God. It's
yeah.
God, right. Like, same thing. The incarnation was not talked about much when I was...
No,
but
not at all. Yeah. And then so the crucifixion, the fact that grace and forgiveness, like these things are accessible to us now. And then the resurrection, that we have hope and that there's a possibility of new life and that we can die to our old selves, like all these things. And then the ascension, the lordship of Jesus Christ, that he is ruling over the kingdom of heaven now. This isn't a future only reality, but that we can actually experience glimpses and tastes and participations in the kingdom of heaven now, because Jesus ascended to the throne. Like, these are parts of the good news that we need to recapture as Christians, because each one of them help us to live out a holistic presentation of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the discipleship process. Each one of them are so important to who we are as Christians, but then also how we testify to witness in our everyday lives. So if we're filled with hope in a hopeless world, that's attractive to people. If we live a moral standard of way of life that in a moralless, immoral society, that's at least curiosity invoking to people. If we can show forgiveness and love and sacrifice and humility in a culture that devalues those things, then people will ask questions about that. So it's about living the way of life, the whole of the good news, the ramifications of each one of those, or implications, as we've been talking about through this series, that leads to our actions that allow us to even have conversations with people. But if we reduce the good news, to only, I receive Christ, the actions he did on the cross, and I will die when I go to heaven, then why would anybody be curious about asking us about our lives now? So it's not a reduction of the cross, it's an expansion of the whole good news, recapturing these rich traditions that have been going on for thousands of years of Christianity. It's not like this isn't attested through the Christian community for thousands of years from many, many, many different people. It's just a reclaiming of the fullness of the gospel.
Yeah, I think the reason you say it, like, I'm not trying to downplay, is because for the last 30 years or however long, it has been the central thing, which is why we have sort of hollowed out Christianity so much, I think, is because we have put our faith in the future saving of Christ, but not in the fact that He saves us into His Spirit, and He shows us a way to live now. This isn't, like you said, it's not a future orientation. It's now and future.
Yeah, we're in Christ now.
Yeah, and so it's not a downplaying of the cross, but it's a sense that in our sole focus on the cross, we've forgotten and lost so much about what it really means to follow Jesus and to have life to the full now and forever.
Yeah.
The promise that He offered. So.
And that, maybe I'm wrong, but spiritual practices are a part of that, and things that I think sometimes we've even been talking about as a staff, and talking about a Sabbath. Just being a part of your spiritual practice. And it's like there's all these things that I think in my mind that maybe I hear as words, but they're not something that are part of things that I appreciate or take into action.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that, and because it's one of the things that I was kind of excited to talk about on the podcast today is, so we've been going through in the Centered series this claims, reasons, implications, and then actions. And that is, I don't discount that. I know that that's the progress that some people make. However, when you talk about spiritual disciplines, I also think that there's good reason to believe that you can start with actions and they form you into ultimately believing in your claims. I think the circle can work backwards. And I think that's exactly what the spiritual disciplines do. And I don't necessarily think Jesus was being formulaic, because I don't think he necessarily thought that way. But what did he say? He said, follow me, because I am the way, the truth, and the life. So think about that. You follow Jesus on the way of Jesus, and he reveals his truth as you live out the way. And that's a step of faith, right? Like knowing that Jesus is who he said he was and wants an abundant life for me. I trust that. So I step into faith, into his way of life. Even if I don't even fully agree with it yet, or I cognitively assent, right? That's what I think. Like, we've got it backwards sometimes in our Western culture since the Enlightenment. We've believed in the myth that we can produce right acting only by right thinking. And it's both. I don't we absolutely need the Braxton Hunters of the world that I listen to the podcast, Wonderful Mind, apologetics, thinking, cognitive assent first. Those things are very, very important. That was actually my own journey. I went, as soon as I said Jesus is Lord, I went to seminary because I thought I needed to learn as much about it. And I did need to learn as much, but learning comes from doing as well, right? And so I love Francis Schaeffer has a line about Christian community being the final apologetic. And the reason why is because the Christian community is living out the way of Jesus together. This is a Christian community, and that's certainly what we saw. Zach referenced the explosion of the early church and how it kind of toppled the ancient Roman worldview. Well, the reason why is because people were seeing and observing the apology for the Christian faith being this Christian community of people who were still working out their faith. the canon of the Bible had not even been finalized yet. But they believed in Jesus and said, I'm going to follow the way of Jesus. And then the truth was revealed through that following of the way so that they could have abundant life. And when we always think that we have to get our right thinking first, instead of just in faith following in the way of Jesus, then we put restrictions on what God and Jesus may want to do through our lives. And so I would just say that I don't know exactly how to land this plane.
Well, when you think about the disciples,
that's why Zach's here.
When you think about the disciples themselves, they followed Jesus a long time, practicing his way before they had any kind of mental assent to him being the Messiah, right?
Yeah, it's the testimony of Scripture, and I don't know why we've gotten so far away from that. I think it goes back, again, to centuries long of believing that we process information and gather information and live out life in a certain way. Yeah. When and again, I don't discount the importance of intellectual integrity and philosophy, really reflecting and thinking through these things. But yeah, when you just take the witness of the Gospels for what they are and see how Jesus went about making disciples, it was follow me, right?
Practice what I'm doing.
I'll follow the way, and then I'll reveal truth to you, and you will have abundant life through that.
Yeah, I think that the focus. I think that the over-focus on the cross that I kind of mentioned, that came out of an overcorrection from this sort of like very morally based works type beliefs that the church had for a long time, in the earlier 20th century, and so we had. I felt like it feels like we had to separate ourselves from works and the cross, and so we just emptied ourselves of works and said. And trust me, I'm not a saved by works, but what you get when you lose all that is the cross again stands just to save you for future, and not that there is this thing that is growing in the way of Christ that has nothing to do with your eternal salvation, but has everything to do with the fullness of life that you can experience.
Yeah, I want us to get rid of the either or and embrace a both and mentality, because like God is so much bigger than our limited finite thinking, and to think that it's either or. Whenever we say it has to be these either or, usually I'm like, okay, yeah, God's probably somewhere in the center, centered series.
Oh, wow. Way to bring it back.
Yeah, but I will say, when we talk about living out a Christian worldview or center being a Christian worldview, like I have a teenage daughter who's wrestling through these things right now, certainly pushing boundaries of faith and questions and things that I went through at the time. And what I wish someone would have told me, and what I do tell my daughter, and what I would like to share with our next gen people, is that don't think that Christianity is an event to go to or a set of beliefs to assent to, although it's important to do that. But it's a way of life. It is a way of life. And don't think that you have to have all the answers in place, or you have to have these positive affirmations in place before you can start living in the way of Jesus. And then put it to the test. We want to talk about claims and reasons and implications. Put it to the test. For example, in our cultural narrative right now, sex, big deal, right? Like it's everywhere. It's in media. People are getting a lot of different messages. What if you actually lived out the way of Jesus in this domain or area of your sexual life? What if you actually surrendered to that and lived that out? What if you went in the way of Jesus first? Mm-hmm. I promise you the truth of that will be revealed, and that you then will have a much more abundant life living under this. But test it. Go on the journey.
So like a dare to live out Jesus' vision for life, Jesus' vision for sexuality, Jesus' vision for simplicity.
Yeah.
Those kind of things.
And see if you
feel less fractured, feel less fragile, feel all
I think that was even the last line of our Who is Jesus film. Do we lean in and dare to follow him in the ways that he's taught us? And I think one thing before I move on to probably our last question. As you were saying that, like, I was thinking that obviously the series for me has helped me, I think, love Jesus more. I mean, and so the intellectual side of it, the studying side, is always something that's ongoing. I mean, it's always something that you're learning more, but me understanding another worldview helps me appreciate the one that I affirm even more. And so I think that there is a whole side of there that I totally get the point you're making, but I think it's just, I've enjoyed being able to go through that because it helps me understand even more why, instead of just sometimes just saying it. So
yeah.
You want to say something else?
No, that was good. Good job.
Okay, cool. So I kind of want to close up with one question, and it's something that could be fun. It could be not fun. I don't know. But what are some common objections that you hear from unbelieving friends, and how do you respond?
You want me to go first?
Go for it.
Well, I'll say this: if you're saying friends, like real friends, people that are my actual friends I hang out with, they don't really put much objections out there. I think it's because they would rather not broach the subject at all. Faith and politics. People don't like doing that, and they know I'm a Christian, and I think it's partially uncomfortable for them to a certain degree. And I think it's one of those things, I'm totally making an assumption, an interpretive leap here, but I think it's one of those things where they're like, oh, that's good for Austin. That works for him. I'm glad he has that in his life. So I don't know that I get many objections from my friends. From people that I know more generally, it's a lot of the pseudo, like, fake. Sorry, that's not fair to them. It's like what I would call repetitive popular narrative stuff, like these things that we've heard, that we just mentioned earlier about the unreliability of the Bible. Like, that's just bad historicity. Like, it's not, I don't think it's not genuine, as far as there's proofs and explanations for that out there if they would genuinely go on the journey to find it. I think a lot of them are around suffering and existential realities.
Sure.
I think that all the classic ones, why would God allow this? I think those kind of existential questions have I deal with them and wrestle with them. They're tough, they're hard. I don't think there's any good answer for them except in what we can always say in our faith is look to Jesus, follow in the way of Jesus, and you will find answers there. Maybe not ones that perfectly align everything in our minds, but there's at least a coherent answer within the Christian faith in that. And so I think that we hit on it a little bit earlier, but I think in the end it's relationships, like you said. It's knowing people, knowing who they are, knowing where they're at in the journey of their life, drawing near to them, knowing the fullness of the gospel, and being able to speak these cultural moments, being able to make clear the gospel in them as you walk in life with them. I think that's just some of the stuff that I've heard people say, but I very rarely hear people in everyday life say these things that Braxton has to deal with on YouTube videos. So I think it's really a final apologetic, that love. Like, I know that's a cheesy answer or a simplified answer, but showing people the sacrificial love of Jesus in tangible ways in their life every day, but then pointing them to the reality of Jesus as being the foundation for that hope. I think that's kind of how I respond to those people. I would wish I did have more conversations on this deeper stuff, but do you
get those kinds of questions at Community One? Like when you're working in neighborhoods, do you get to have those kinds of conversations?
Well, the interesting thing about that is a lot of marginalized people that have been marginalized in our culture, thinking of generational poverty and such things like that, they're affirming Christians. Like in the neighborhood in TV Park, 71% of our neighbors are self-professing Christians. And I think that's really important to remember. And when you think in the terms of the Old Testament and God's kind of command to love the orphans, widows, and sojourners and integrate them back into the community, they were Israelites, right? Like they were the marginalized in our community don't necessarily, we shouldn't just say they're people far from God. Like I think that's a gross mischaracterization. But our love for marginalized populations is what then give us the right to stand before a culture that won't step into that space and say, this is the way of Jesus. This is, as we go towards our ultimate mission of reconciliation of all things, we will minister to the marginalized, and it gives us credibility, just like it did the ancient Christians in the early Roman Empire, as they were throwing babies on trash heaps and as they were running out of towns as people were dying from plagues, the Christians were ministering to these marginalized people. And it revolutionized the ancient Roman worldview. And so we need to step back into that as kind of what Francis Schaeffer and Bonhoeffer said is our final apologetic Christian community.
Yeah. Yeah, same thing with the conversations. I do hear, the suffering, and sometimes the suffering even comes from inside of belief, people that do believe, still have to deal with that. And taking it back to the cross, I feel like our Christology has so much to say about that that actually can at least be somewhat satisfying in a sense that only in Christianity do we have a God that entered into our world and suffered. He suffered injustice at the cross. That was injustice. And he suffered shame at the cross, and he suffered pain at the cross. And so he entered that with us. He knows what that is, what it feels like, what it means. And so I think it was Keller maybe that said that while it doesn't give us a reason why we suffer, it gives us a reason, it lets us know at least why we don't. And it's not because God doesn't love us, because he loved us enough to enter into that with us. And so so I think the cross, while still not completely satisfying, is the best answer to that suffering question. But then I would just affirm again what Austin was saying, that at this cultural moment, to me, the best apologetic is to practice the way of Jesus, because it is countercultural. Live that out, and then maybe once again we would be seen as living differently. And we've been so just unrecognizable any difference from culture for so long that if we truly practice the way of Jesus, I think it would be really drawing people in. So
yeah, and I know we're probably out of time. You can cut this if you want, but I want to add to that.
Coffee's kicking in, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's a word. We talk about having conversations with people and in this cultural moment. There's a word that I learned in our when I team taught Intro to Christian Worldview. It's called internal coherence. And so understanding how other people's worldviews is actually internally coherent should help us not be so defensive when people push up against our beliefs and maybe live out a different way of life than what we do. And so when we talk about having conversations with people, when we can step fully into their worldview and explain it, the internal coherence of their worldview from their perspective, number one, like you said, it made me more confident in my own faith, because I was like, oh yeah, well, I can now choose with a full menu here which one I think makes the most sense. But also it instead of like, how do these people not believe this stuff, or like getting angry or defensive when they talk about points of their worldview that are different from ours, now I understand it. Now I can empathize. Now I can fully step into what Braxton called the strongman argument that some people are doing these philosophical debates. It's truly stepping fully into their worldview that then helps you in conversation with other people, and they'll feel valued.
Right.
Like that's really, really important. They will feel valued in the conversation because you've taken the time to not be defensive, to not be angry, not to point fingers, but instead to understand them and to value them as thinking individuals instead of people that oh, I don't know why they would think this different way. Well, work out the internal coherence of other worldviews, and that will help you have these faith conversations from a Christian worldview.
I love that. It's great. And guys, it's been fun. We've had a lot of great topics, and hopefully some things for people to go back and even write some of these things down. Find some of the books that both Zach and Austin mentioned. Austin even wrote a blog on our Explorers blog talking about a list of books that he challenged people to read. He even said he'd buy them a steak dinner.
Not just a steak dinner. I said I would take them to Kavanaugh's buy a steak dinner.
I've never been to Kavanaugh's.
It's only 10 books.
Oh, 10 books?
10 books?
Oh, I thought you said 10 bucks. I'm like, that's a cheap
No,
steak.
No. It's a lot more bucks than that. But I said anyone who would read that. I was challenging people because the other side of that is like, I think a lot of times people say they disbelieve or they say there's these reasons for faith, but then they're not genuinely exploring actual, well thought out Christian. They're attacking a Christian caricature, and they maybe don't even want to seek out and spend time. And it does take time. It's an investment of time that unfortunately many Christians don't take the time to do, but certainly if Christians aren't taking the time to do it, why would people from another worldview? And so I extended that invitation not only out to skeptics and explorers, but even to Christians. Someone please read this list.
Has anyone ever taken you up on it?
No.
Oh man. Well, it's still out there. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes. Zach, thanks for helping me co-host. You did a great job.
Yes, you did.
Terrific job. Austin, 6th time. Always fun having you on here.
Thank you.
And we had no problem turning this into a 2-part episode.
Yeah, I have a lot of hot air to blow.
No, it was great. I love this conversation. It's good information to have. Guys, if you have any questions, anything we can pass along, you can email us here at the podcast@onelifechurch.org, and we'd love to connect with you that way, and love for you guys to share this content out. It'd be really great if you did that. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you next week. We'd love to hear from you guys. You can email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org. You can leave a comment on YouTube or on Apple Podcast or anywhere you're listening to this podcast. We'd love for you guys to share that out. Let more people hear this great content and have an opportunity to continue that conversation even further. Our music was produced by Micah Robertson and Ben Brock. My name's Sarah, and I produced this episode.